Okay, so this is the Daf for April 28th, 2025. We are in Makkot 20. So here we go. The end of 19, it says, let's see here, where he says that poor man's tithe shall be designated the south side if it is a year of poor man's tithe, that is the 3rd or 6th years of the sabbatical cycle. He is located anywhere in the outlying areas, not in Jerusalem. In those cases, if he ate the fig, he is flogged. This is Daf 20 now. He is flogged with one set of lashes because he ate it without separating teruma of the tithe from the first tithe and is consequently liable for eating untithed produce. He had separated teruma of the tithe. It would have been permitted for him to eat the entire fig, as it is permitted for a priest to partake of both teruma gadola and teruma of the tithe. And a non-priest who eats the fig is flogged with 2 sets of lashes for both eating untithed produce and eating the teruma therein, which is forbidden for all non-priests. The Baraita notes, as if the non-priest ate the fig initially, before separating teruma and tithes, he is flogged with only 1 set of lashes for eating untithed produce. Once he separated the teruma and tithes, he is flogged for eating teruma as well. The Gemara infers from the statement in the Baraita, and it is a year when second tithe is separated and he is in Jerusalem. The reason he is flogged with 2 sets of lashes is that he is currently in Jerusalem, where it is prohibited to partake of second tithe produce. But if he ate the fig in the outlying areas outside of Jerusalem and he designated second tithe in the fig, he is flogged with 3 sets of lashes. It is apparent that even if this second tithe produce has not entered within the wall of Jerusalem, one is liable to receive lashes for its consumption. This contradicts Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, as he holds that one is liable to receive lashes for eating second tithe produce only if it entered Jerusalem. The Gemara answers, the case in the Baraita is one where they took the fig into Jerusalem and then took it out of Jerusalem. That is why he's liable to receive a 3rd set of lashes. The Gemara asked, if so, what is the purpose of stating this halacha? If the fig entered and exited Jerusalem, there is no novel element in the fact that one is liable to receive lashes. The Gemara answers, there is a novel element in this halacha as what we are dealing with here. We are dealing with a case where one took figs into the city while they had the status of untithed produce before teruma and tithes were separated. And Rabbi Yoshi holds that the status of gifts that were not separated from the produce is like that of gifts that were already separated. The novel element is that although second tithe is not separated in practice, all the halachot of second tithe are in effect with regard to the portion that he intends to separate as second tithe. Therefore, if after taking the untithed produce into Jerusalem, he separated the second tithe, took it outside of Jerusalem, and ate it, he is liable to receive lashes. The Gemara asks, and does Rabbi Yoshi hold that the status of gifts that were not yet separated from the produce is like that of gifts that were already separated? But isn't it taught in the Baraita that Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Yoshi, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel did not disagree with regard to produce whose labor was not completed, and the obligation to tithe had consequently not yet taken effect, and which at the stage passed through Jerusalem, that its second tithe produce may be redeemed and may be eaten anywhere. As long as the obligation to tithe has not taken effect, the sanctity of Jerusalem does not affect the produce. With regard to what case did they disagree? It is with regard to produce whose labor was already completed and it passed through Jerusalem before terumot and tithes were separated from it. As Beit Shammai say, since one is obligated to separate second tithe from this produce, and the produce was in Jerusalem, he must bring its second tithe produce back to Jerusalem, and it shall be eaten in Jerusalem. And Beit Hillel say the produce may be redeemed and eaten anywhere. And if it enters your mind to say the status of gifts that were not yet separated from the produce is like that of gifts that were already separated, how can Beit Hillel hold that the second tithe produce may be redeemed? Wasn't the produce admitted by the walls of Jerusalem? Therefore, even though second tithe was not yet separated, it can no longer be redeemed. Apparently, Rabbi Yoshi, who certainly holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Hillel, holds that the status of gifts that were not yet separated from the produce is not like that of gifts that were already separated. Rabbah said, the halacha of the wall with regard to eating second tithe produce, that is, second tithe produce may not be eaten outside of the wall of Jerusalem, is by Torah law. The halacha of the wall with regard to the admitting of second tithe produce, that is, that once the produce enters within the wall of Jerusalem, it may not be redeemed or taken beyond the wall, is by rabbinic law. And when the sages issued the decree that one may not remove from Jerusalem second tithe produce that entered into the walls, they did so when the tithe is in its unadulterated form after it was separated, but in a case where it is in it is in its status of untithed produce. The sages did not issue a decree. Ravina said Rabbi Yoshi is referring to the case of second tithe produce that was already separated and brought into Jerusalem. And the novel element of this statement is that he is referring to a fig that was not physically taken into Jerusalem. Rather, it is a case where one is holding the fig on a reed outside of Jerusalem, while he is standing inside Jerusalem. And resolve the dilemma of Rav Papa, and conclude that if one is standing inside Jerusalem and holding second tithe outside of the city on a reed, it is as though the produce entered the city. The Mishnah. Back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, one who creates a bald spot upon his head, and one who rounds the edge of his head by shaving the hair adjacent to the ear, and one who mars the edge of his beard, and one who cuts one incision in the display of the mourning over the dead, are all liable to receive lashes. If he cut one incision over 5 dead people, or 5 incisions over 1 dead person, he is liable to receive lashes for each and every one. For rounding the edges of the head, one is liable to receive 2 sets of lashes, one from here, the hair adjacent to one ear, and one from there, the hair adjacent to the other ear. For marring the edges of his beard, there are 2 edges from here, on one side of his face, and 2 from there, on the other side, and 1 from below. This is on his chin. Rabbi Eliezer says if he removed the hair on all edges of his beard in one action, he is liable to receive only 1 set of lashes for all of them. And one is liable for marring the edges of his beard only if he removes the hair with a razor. Rabbi Eliezer says even if he removed the hair with tweezers or with a plane, he is liable to receive lashes. Back to the Gemara. The Gemara says, the sages taught from the verse concerning the priest, they shall not create a bald spot upon their heads. Leviticus 21, verse 5. One might have thought that even if he created 4 or 5 bald spots in one action, he would be liable to receive only 1 set of lashes. Therefore, the verse states bald spot in the singular to render one liable to receive lashes for each and every bald spot. The verse continues, upon their heads, what is the meaning when the verse states that term? Since it is stated, you shall neither lacerate yourselves nor place a bald spot between your eyes for the dead. Deuteronomy 14, verse 1. One might have thought that one would be liable only for placing a bald spot between the eyes. From where is it derived that the prohibition includes placing a bald spot on the entire head? The verse states, upon their heads, to include the entire head. And I have derived this prohibition only with regard to priests, for whom the Torah established numerous additional mitzvot, since the verse, quote, they shall not create a bald spot, is written in the context of the halachot of priests. From where do I derive that a non-priest is also liable for violating that prohibition? Bald spot is here stated, Deuteronomy 14, verse 1, with regard to non-priest, and bald spot is stated here with regard to priest. Just as there, with regard to priest, one is liable for each and every bald spot that he creates, and is liable for a bald spot created anywhere on his head, as he is for a bald spot created between his eyes, so too here, with regard to a non-priest, one is liable for each and every bald spot that he creates, and is liable for a bald spot created anywhere on his head, as he is for a bald spot created between the eyes. And just as there, with regard to non-priests, the prohibition is stated with regard to creating a bald spot as an expression of mourning over the dead, so too here, with regard to priests, the prohibition is stated with regard to creating a bald spot as an expression of mourning over the dead. The Gemara asks, with regard to these 4 or 5 bald spots created over one dead person, for which one is liable to receive lashes for each and every spot, what are the circumstances? If we say that he created those bald spots one after the other and with 5 separate forewarnings, one preceding each action, it is obvious that he is liable for each and every bald spot. In that case, he is one who violates the same prohibition several times and is punished for each violation for which he was forewarned. Rather, say that he created 5 bald spots with 1 forewarning, one is liable in that case. Is one liable in that case? But didn't we learn in the Mishnah, so 21a, that would be tomorrow's daf, a Nazirite who is drinking wine all day is liable to receive only 1 set of lashes. If onlookers said to him, do not drink, forewarning him several times, and he drinks after each forewarning, he is liable to receive lashes for each and every drink. The Gemara answers, no, this halacha is necessary only with regard to one who, after forewarning, smeared his 5 fingers in a depilatory agent, or nasha, and then placed his fingers simultaneously on his hair, thereby creating 5 bald spots, as in that case. It is tantamount to a forewarning for each and every bald spot that he created. The novel element is that each bald spot is an independent transgression. The Gemara asks, and how much is the measure of a bald spot, for which one is liable? Rav Huna says, it must be of sufficient size so that bald skin must be visible on the head. Rabbi Yochanan says, in the name of Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Shimon, it is the size of a Sicilian bean. The Gemara comments, this Amoric dispute is parallel to a dispute between Tanaim, and how much is the measure of a bald spot? It is the size of a Sicilian bean. Ahirim say it must be sufficient size that bald skin will be visible on the head. Rav Yehuda bar Chaviva said that there are 3 Tanaim who disagree concerning this matter. One says a spot the size of a Sicilian bean, and one says a spot of sufficient size so that bald skin will be visible on the head, and one says a spot that is the measure of 2 hairs. And there is one who removed the opinion that it is the measure of 2 hairs and inserted an opinion that it is the size of a lentil. And your mnemonic to remember the different opinions is from a Mishnah with regard to the halachot of leprosy, Negaim 6:5. The measure of impurity for a snow-white leprous mark, or baheret, is a Sicilian bean, and the measure of impurity for the raw flesh that grows within the baheret is a lentil. It is related. In a related halacha, the sage is taught, one who removes a scissorsful, or melopihazag, of hair from his head on Shabbat is liable. And how much is a scissorful? Rav Yehuda says 2 hairs. The Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a Braita, for a bald spot, the measure is 2 hairs, from which it may be inferred that the measure with regard to labor on Shabbat is different than for a bald spot? The Gemara answers, amend the Braita and say, and likewise with regard to a bald spot, the measure is 2 hairs, indicating that the measure for Shabbat and the measure for a bald spot are the same. All right. It is also taught in a Braita, one who removes a scissorful of hair on Shabbat is liable. And how much is a scissorful? It is 2 hairs. Rabbi Eliezer says 1 hair. And the rabbis concede to Rabbi Eliezer in the case of one who removes white hairs from black ones, even if he removes 1 hair, that he is liable. Since his intent was to remove that particular hair, its removal constitutes complete action. The Gemara adds, and for a man, that matter is prohibited even during the week, due to the fact that it is stated, quote, neither shall a man don a woman's garment, Deuteronomy 22, verse 5. Removal of white hairs is for the purposes of beautification, is characteristic of women, and it is prohibited for a man to perform those actions. The Mishnah teaches, and one who rounds the edges of his head is flogged. The sages taught, the edge of his head is the extremity of his head. And why is the extremity of his head? And why is the extremity of his head? This is reference to one who levels the hairline of his temples to hairline behind his ear to the hairline of his forehead. There is no hair behind the ears on the forehead. One who removes hair from the temples so that they will be like those areas violates prohibition against rounding the edges of his head. The Tana taught a Braita before Rav Chisda, both one who rounds the edges of his head and one for whom the edges of his head are rounded are flogged. Rav Chisda said to him, is one who eats dates that are in a sieve flogged? By analogy, if a person rounded the edges of another's head, why should the person whose head was rounded receive lashes? He performed no action. Rav Chisda proceeded to explain to the Tana, in response to one who says to you, who is the Tana of the Braita, say that it is Rabbi Yehuda, who says in the case of a prohibition that does not involve an action, one is flogged for its violation. Rava says, this Braita can be explained as referring to one who rounds the edges of his head for himself, and he is liable both for rounding the edges of his head and for having the edges of his head rounded, and everyone agrees that he is flogged because he performed an action. Rav Ashi says, this Braita can be explained as referring to a case where the one for whom the edges of his head are being rounded assists the person rounding his head by repositioning his head to facilitate that rounding, and everyone agrees that he is flogged. The Mishnah teaches, one who mars the edge of his head is flogged. The sages taught, the edge of his beard is the extremity of his beard. And what is the extremity of his beard? It is the stalk of his beard. That is the 5 edges of the beard enumerated in the Mishnah, where the hair collects in one spot like grain on stalks. The Mishnah teaches, and one who cuts one incision in display of mourning over the dead is flogged. The sages taught a halakhic midrash on the verse. Quote, in an incision for the soul you shall not place in your flesh. Leviticus 19:28. Had the verse stated only, quote, in an incision, one might have thought that this prohibition applies to an incision cut in sorrow, even if he cut an incision in sorrow over his house that collapsed or over his ship that sunk at sea. Therefore, the verse states, for the soul, for which it is derived that he is liable for an incision in mourning only for the dead alone. And from where is it derived that one who cuts 5 incisions in mourning over one dead person is liable for each and every incision? The verse states, quote, and an incision. Render him liable for each and every incision. Rabbi Yoshi says, from where is it derived concerning one who cuts one incision in mourning over 5 dead people, that he is liable for each and every person for whom he cut that incision? The verse states, for the soul, to render him liable for each and every dead person. The Gemara asks, why didn't you already derive from the term for the soul an exception for one who cut an incision in sorrow over his house that collapsed or over his ship that sunk at sea? And that is the end of Daf 20. And so Chodesh Tov, 2-day Rosh Chodesh, because the month was 30 days. And so a lot to look forward to in this month. A lot of counting in all the Torah portions, everything, lots of counting the Omer, Lag BaOmer coming up. So we had a little bit of a thing for Rosh Chodesh. Thanks to everybody who came. It was a lot of fun. Went through 19 Daf 19 and had some good discussion and everything. So counted the Omer, had some fun. Okay, but if you're local and you want to join in, just email. The email's in the description for most of the videos. So thanks for watching.